The arrogant tourist lunged for the ceremonial guard's ancient helmet, treating it like a souvenir to be claimed. But in one lightning-fast movement, the guardian's response left the entire plaza stunned into silence. What followed would be remembered in Montreal for years to come, as a testament to what happens when sacred tradition collides with modern. The autumn morning at Montreal's Grand Cathedral Square painted a picture of timeless dignity. Golden maple leaves danced through the crisp October air, settling gently on the weathered cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of history unfold. The magnificent Notre-Dame Basilica cast its ancient shadow across the square, its gothic spires reaching toward a sky that couldn't decide between steel gray and brilliant blue. The morning light filtered through scattered clouds, creating an ever-shifting tapestry of light and shadow across the cathedral's intricate stonework. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Standing before the cathedral's ornate entrance was Michael Laurent, a member of the elite guardians of the Sacred Gate, a centuries-old order that had protected the cathedral's most precious artifacts since 1742. His presence commanded attention, not through movement or speech, but through absolute stillness. The distinctive indigo uniform with silver trim told a story of tradition, while the gleaming ceremonial helmet, adorned with the silver wings of the order, spoke of an unbroken legacy spanning generations. The helmet itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, each feather intricately carved from pure silver, catching and reflecting light like captured starfire. The morning crowd was building as it always did. Tour buses disgorged their contents onto the square, their guides' voices competing with the cathedral bells as they recited historical facts with practiced precision. Cameras clicked incessantly, documenting every angle of the magnificent architecture, and, of course, the stoic guardian who had become as much a part of the attraction as the cathedral itself. The square echoed with the multilingual murmur of visitors from across the globe, their excited whispers creating a constant undercurrent of energy. Children pointed and whispered, elderly couples paused to admire the tradition before them, and teenagers posed for selfies at a respectful distance. A group of school children on a field trip listened intently as their teacher explained the significance of the guardian's post, their young faces filled with wonder at the living piece of history before them. The atmosphere buzzed with the typical energy of a tourist hotspot, yet maintained an undercurrent of reverence that the sacred space commanded. The early morning light caught the silver wings of Laurent's helmet, creating an almost ethereal glow that seemed to form a halo around his steadfast figure. Each breath of wind carried the scent of fresh pastries from the nearby cafes, mixing with the lingering trace of morning incense from the cathedral's first mass. Street musicians had begun to set up their spots along the square's edges, their gentle melodies adding another layer to the morning's awakening symphony. The scene was a perfect blend of the sacred and the ordinary, the ancient and the modern coexisting in delicate balance. Local vendors were setting up their carts along the square's perimeter, their movements well practiced and unhurried. They knew their place in this daily performance, providers of refreshments and souvenirs to the touring masses, but never encroaching upon the cathedral's solemn space. The click-clack of their cartwheels on cobblestones added to the morning's symphony. Some sold traditional Quebecois treats, while others offered religious tokens and postcards, their colorful displays creating a festive border around the sacred space. Among the gathering crowd, most visitors understood the unspoken rules. They maintained their distance, spoke in hushed tones near the cathedral entrance, and treated the space with the respect it deserved. The invisible line that separated the tourist area from the guardian's post was as clear as any physical barrier to most, a boundary drawn by centuries of tradition and respect. Occasionally, a curious child would step too close, only to be gently pulled back by attentive parents who understood the significance of maintaining this respectful distance. The cathedral's massive oak doors opened periodically, releasing the sound of choir practice. Young voices lifted in Latin hymns drifted across the square, their ethereal notes a reminder of the sacred nature of this space. The music seemed to heighten the atmosphere of reverence, causing even the most boisterous tourists to lower their voices instinctively. The morning sun caught the stained glass windows, projecting kaleidoscopes of color onto the square's weathered stones. Laurent stood unwavering, his eyes fixed forward, seeing everything while appearing to focus on nothing. His posture was perfect, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, hands clasped firmly around the ceremonial staff. The morning sun continued its slow climb, causing the shadow of the cathedral's western spire to creep across the square like the hand of a giant sundial. His ceremonial staff, polished to a mirror finish, reflected the morning light like a beacon. Few knew that this particular morning marked the anniversary of the order's founding. For the guardians of the sacred gate, it was a day of special significance, though they marked it with the same stoic dedication they showed every other day of the year. The silver wings on Laurent's helmet gleamed a bit brighter today, polished with extra care in honor of the occasion. Inside the cathedral, special preparations were underway for the anniversary mass that would take place later that day. The square was filling up now, the morning crowd growing denser as tour groups clustered around their guides. Horse-drawn carriages began their daily routes around the historic district, their hooves adding a rhythmic counterpoint to the morning's urban symphony. The day was beginning in earnest, promising to be busy but ordinary, or so it seemed. No one could have predicted how this seemingly typical morning would unfold, or how the actions of one arrogant tourist would test the very foundations of tradition and respect that had stood firm for centuries. Michael Laurent hadn't always dreamed of becoming a guardian of the sacred gate. Growing up in a small village outside Quebec City, he had spent his childhood fascinated by the stories his grandfather told of the ancient order. Now, at 32, he had earned his place among these legendary protectors through years of dedication and unwavering discipline. His journey from a wide-eyed child to one of the most respected guardians in the order was a testament to his extraordinary commitment to preserving tradition. Standing at 6'2", Laurent cut an imposing figure in his ceremonial uniform. The indigo fabric, hand-woven by local artisans using techniques passed down through generations, fit his athletic frame perfectly. Every button, every seam, every silver accent had been meticulously maintained. His black boots, polished to mirror-like perfection, reflected the morning light with each subtle shift of his weight. But it was his bearing, more than his physical presence, that truly set him apart. Laurent's face, clean-shaven and weathered by countless hours standing watch in all conditions, bore the kind of quiet dignity that came from absolute certainty in one's purpose. His hazel eyes, though fixed straight ahead, missed nothing. Years of training had taught him to maintain his stoic expression while remaining acutely aware of his surroundings. The slight creases at the corners of his eyes were the only hint of the thousands of hours he'd spent standing guard, enduring everything from scorching summer heat to bitter winter storms. The silver-winged helmet he wore wasn't just a piece of ceremonial attire. It was a sacred trust. Each wing had been crafted by master silversmiths in 1742, when the order was founded. The helmet had been passed down through generations of guardians, each one adding to its legacy of honor and service. Laurent could still remember the weight of responsibility he'd felt when it was first placed upon his head 5 years ago, after completing his rigorous training and taking his solemn vows. His daily routine began long before the tourists arrived. Every morning, Laurent rose at 4 a.m. to begin his preparations. The uniform required precisely 45 minutes to don correctly, each piece having its own specific order and ritual. The helmet alone needed 20 minutes of careful polishing, not just for appearance, but as a meditation on the responsibility it represented. These weren't mere habits or regulations. They were acts of devotion that connected him to every guardian who had served before. Few visitors knew that Laurent held a master's degree in religious history from McGill University, or that he spoke 4 languages fluently. Fewer still realized that he had turned down lucrative corporate positions to answer what he felt was a higher calling. His fellow guardians knew him as more than just the stoic figure tourists photographed. They knew of his dedication to training new recruits, his encyclopedic knowledge of the cathedral's history, and his quiet acts of kindness toward the local community. The ceremonial staff he held, carved from ancient oak and topped with silver medallions depicting the cathedral's history, was more than just a symbol of authority. It was a practical tool, perfectly balanced and capable of being used defensively if needed. though such occasions were exceedingly rare. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Laurent had spent countless hours practicing the traditional movements with it, until they became as natural as breathing. Each guardian developed their own subtle relationship with their staff, and Laurent's was an extension of his unwavering resolve. During his 5 years of service, Laurent had faced his share of challenges. He'd maintained his composure through everything from drunken wedding parties to overzealous social media influencers trying to provoke a reaction. His record was impeccable, his dedication unquestioned. The senior members of the order had even begun speaking of him as a future leader, though Laurent himself never dwelt on such possibilities. His focus remained solely on his duty, on being worthy of the trust placed in him. Today's anniversary held special significance for Laurent. It marked not only the founding of the order but also the day his grandfather, a former guardian himself, had first brought him to the cathedral as a child. He could still remember standing in awe of the guardian on duty, never imagining that one day he would wear the same uniform, carry the same responsibilities. His grandfather had passed away 2 years ago, but Laurent felt his presence strongest during these quiet morning moments, when the rising sun painted the cathedral in shades of gold and purple. Despite his complete stillness, Laurent's mind remained sharp and alert. His training had taught him to maintain an almost meditative state while remaining acutely aware of his surroundings. He could sense the ebb and flow of the crowd, detect subtle changes in the atmosphere that might signal potential issues. This heightened awareness, combined with his unwavering discipline, had helped him prevent numerous incidents before they could escalate, always with the quiet dignity his position demanded. As the morning crowd continued to grow, Laurent remained a picture of perfect composure, embodying centuries of tradition in every measured breath. Little did he know that this ordinary October morning would soon test every aspect of his training, challenging not just his discipline, but the very values he had sworn to uphold. The grand cathedral square had always been a meeting point of worlds, sacred and secular, ancient and modern, local and foreign. This morning was no different, as the space filled with its usual diverse cast of characters. Local office workers cut through the square on their way to nearby buildings, briefcases in one hand, steaming cups of coffee in the other. They moved with practiced efficiency, barely glancing at the sights they'd seen countless times before, though many still offered respectful nods to Laurent as they passed. Tour guides in their distinctive blue jackets gathered their groups, their practiced speeches mixing and overlapping in various languages. Marie Dubois, a veteran guide of 15 years, was explaining to her group the significance of the silver-winged helmet, how it had survived the Great Fire of 1856, and how it had become a symbol of endurance and protection. Her voice carried clearly across the square, adding another layer to the morning's atmospheric symphony. Near the cathedral steps, Father Thomas Bernard, the elderly head priest, emerged briefly to oversee the morning's preparations. His weathered face brightened at the sight of Laurent standing at his post, and he paused momentarily in silent appreciation of the tradition they both served. The priest had known Laurent since his first day of training and had watched him grow into his role with quiet pride. Their shared dedication to preserving the sacred space created an unspoken bond of mutual respect. Street artists had begun setting up their easels along the square's eastern edge, where the morning light was best. Among them was old Pierre, who had been painting the cathedral and its guardians for over 3 decades. His watercolors captured not just the physical scene, but somehow managed to convey the weight of history and tradition that permeated the space. Today, his skilled hands were already sketching the preliminary lines of what would become another tribute to the square's timeless dignity. A group of local school children on a field trip gathered near the cathedral's information center, their excited chatter controlled by watchful teachers. Many of them wore the blue and white uniforms of St. Mary's Academy, a school that had been sending students to learn about the cathedral's history for generations. Their young eyes widened as their teacher explained the guardian's role, some of them practicing the strict posture they observed. The morning air was filled with the aroma of fresh pastries from Madame Rousseau's cafe, which had occupied its corner of the square for over 50 years. The elderly proprietor took pride in maintaining the traditional recipes that had made her establishment a favorite among both locals and tourists. She often said that her croissants and the Guardian's presence were the two most reliable things in the square, both unchanging anchors in an ever-changing world. Around the square's perimeter, security cameras discreetly monitored the space, a modern addition that complemented but never replaced the traditional human guardianship. The cathedral's security system had been carefully designed to be nearly invisible, preserving the historical atmosphere while providing necessary contemporary protection. Laurent knew each camera's location and blind spots intimately, though this knowledge was merely a backup to his own vigilance. A small wedding party arrived for their morning ceremony, the bride's white dress bright against the cathedral's weathered stones. They paused for photographs, careful to maintain a respectful distance from Laurent's post. The photographer, a local who had shot hundreds of weddings here, knew exactly where to position his subjects to capture both the magnificent architecture and the dignified guardian in his frame. The square's ambient sounds created a familiar urban melody. The soft cooing of pigeons, the distant toll of church bells, the gentle splash of the restored Victorian fountain, and the constant murmur of conversations in dozens of languages. Tourists from across the globe mingled with local residents, creating a constantly shifting tapestry of humanity against the backdrop of unchanging stone and tradition. Near the square's entrance, a newly installed digital information kiosk offered historical facts and guidelines in multiple languages, including respectful viewing distances for photographing the Guardian. This modern addition had been carefully designed to blend with its historic surroundings, its screen brightness automatically adjusting to maintain the square's traditional atmosphere. The kiosk quietly displayed the day's significance, the anniversary of the order's founding, though few tourists paused long enough to notice this detail. Local business owners were familiar with the daily rhythm of the square and had adapted their routines accordingly. Shop windows were being polished, outdoor cafe tables arranged with precision, and merchandise displays updated to catch the morning light. Each proprietor understood their role in maintaining the square's delicate balance between commerce and sanctity, their businesses having evolved to complement rather than compete with the sacred space. As the morning progressed, the square continued filling with its regular mix of personalities and purposes. Everything seemed to be following its usual pattern, yet there was an almost imperceptible tension in the air, as if the space itself sensed the approaching disruption to its carefully maintained harmony. The scene was set, the players were in position, and the stage was prepared for an encounter that would test the boundaries between tradition and modern irreverence in ways no one could have anticipated. The morning's peaceful rhythm was shattered by the arrival of a cherry-red Mustang convertible, its engine revving unnecessarily loud as it pulled up to the square's entrance. The car's sound system blasted heavy metal music at a volume that made the nearby pigeons scatter and caused several tour guides to pause mid-sentence. Behind the wheel sat Alexander Alex Thompson, a 45-year-old tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, who had made his fortune developing social media apps that capitalized on people's worst impulses. Thompson emerged from his car with the exaggerated movements of someone who believed the world was his personal stage. His expensive Italian loafers clicked against the cobblestones as he straightened his designer jacket, a garish piece in neon green that seemed to deliberately clash with the square's dignified atmosphere. A gold Rolex glinted on his wrist, and his perfectly whitened teeth flashed in what he probably thought was a charismatic smile, but came across as predatory. "Now this is what I call prime content," he announced to no one in particular, pulling out the latest model smartphone equipped with an array of camera accessories. His voice carried the distinctive drawl of someone who had practiced sounding important. A small entourage of social media followers who had been waiting nearby immediately gravitated toward him, their own phones ready to capture whatever spectacle he planned to create. Thompson's entire demeanor screamed of new money and misplaced confidence. His carefully styled hair had probably taken an hour to look artificially messy, and his designer sunglasses, still worn despite the overcast day, bore a logo large enough to be seen from across the square. A custom t-shirt beneath his jacket read, "Rules are for followers," in bold, holographic letters, a slogan from his latest app that encouraged users to post videos of themselves breaking social norms for viral fame. "Ladies and gentlemen, get ready for the most epic cathedral tour ever," he announced to his live stream audience, his phone held at the perfect angle to capture both his face and the historic backdrop. "Today we're going to show these stuck-up Canadians how to really appreciate their tourist attractions. Don't forget to smash that like button and get ready for some serious entertainment." Several local vendors exchanged knowing glances. They had seen his type before, wealthy tourists who mistook their financial success for cultural superiority. Marie Dubois, the veteran tour guide, subtly began moving her group away from Thompson's vicinity, recognizing the telltale signs of approaching trouble. Father Thomas, who had been about to return inside, paused at the cathedral door, his experienced eyes tracking the potential disruption. Thompson strutted across the square like he owned it, his small crowd of followers maintaining a careful distance, close enough to film whatever happened, but far enough away to avoid direct involvement. He paused occasionally to take selfies, each pose more elaborate than the last, deliberately stepping over the velvet ropes that marked restricted areas as if they were mere suggestions rather than boundaries. "Watch this," he stage whispered to his live stream audience, pointing his camera toward Laurent. "These guards think they're so special with their fancy uniforms and silly hats. But guess what? I've dealt with better security at my pool parties. Time to show everyone what real social media content looks like." His followers tittered nervously, their own phones raised in anticipation. The regular tourists began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the building tension. A few parents quietly ushered their children away from the scene, while others reached for their phones, preparing to document whatever was about to unfold. "Hey, you see that helmet?" Thompson continued, his voice carrying across the now quieting square. "My followers have been daring me to try it on all morning. And you know me, I never disappoint my audience." He adjusted his camera gimbal, ensuring he would capture every angle of whatever he was planning. The silver wings of Laurent's helmet caught the morning light, seemingly oblivious to the approaching threat. But those who knew the Guardian well might have noticed the subtle shift in his posture, a nearly imperceptible tensing of his shoulders, a slight firming of his jaw. Years of training had taught him to recognize trouble before it fully manifested, and every instinct was now quietly alerting him to the approaching confrontation. Thompson's live-stream chat was exploding with a mix of encouragement and warnings, but he only acknowledged the comments that aligned with his intentions. "What's that? You think I won't do it? You think I'm scared of some ceremonial mall cop? Watch and learn, people. This is how you go viral." The square's usual bustling atmosphere had transformed into an anticipatory hush. Even the perpetual cooing of pigeons seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The morning sun disappeared behind a cloud, casting the scene in diffused gray light that somehow made the moment feel more ominous. As Thompson began his approach, his expensive shoes scuffing carelessly across the historic cobblestones, the weight of centuries of tradition seemed to press down upon the square. The stage was set for a collision between unwavering duty and unrestrained entitlement, between sacred tradition and viral infamy. What would unfold in the next few moments would test not just Laurent's training, but the very principles he had sworn to uphold. The atmosphere in the square shifted palpably as Thompson sauntered closer to Laurent's post. His followers spread out in a loose semicircle, their phones raised like weapons, each hoping to capture the perfect angle of whatever was about to unfold. The regular tourists who had been taking photos of the cathedral moments before now turned their attention to the brewing confrontation, a mix of disapproval and morbid curiosity on their faces. "Make sure you're getting this," Thompson called out to his followers, his voice carrying an edge of theatrical excitement. "This is going to be epic. Watch how I transform this boring old tradition into viral gold." He paused to check his hair in his phone's front-facing camera, adjusting his designer sunglasses for maximum effect. The morning light caught his Rolex as he gestured dramatically, sending little flashes of light dancing across the ancient stones. Marie Dubois, the veteran tour guide, quickly herded her group toward the cathedral's side entrance, her years of experience telling her exactly what kind of situation was developing. "Perhaps we should view the historic stained glass windows now," she suggested, her voice steady but urgent. As she guided them away, she caught the eye of Father Thomas, who had already reached for his phone. Not to record the incident, but to alert Cathedral security. The small group of schoolchildren who had been learning about the Guardian's role now stood frozen, their young faces a mixture of concern and confusion. Their teacher, Ms. Roberts, attempted to use the moment as an impromptu lesson in respect and dignity, but her words were drowned out by Thompson's increasingly loud commentary. "Look at him, trying to pretend I don't exist." Thompson projected his voice even louder, playing to his digital audience. "But trust me, everyone notices Alex Thompson. Did you know I just bought a small island? Yeah, that's right. I could probably buy this whole cathedral if I wanted to." His followers laughed nervously, some beginning to look uncomfortable with the escalating situation. Old Pierre, the street artist, slowly set down his paintbrush, his weathered hands trembling slightly with anger. In 3 decades of painting this square, he had never witnessed such blatant disrespect. His half-finished watercolor captured the tension of the moment, the proud guardian standing firm against the approaching storm of modern arrogance. The morning breeze carried the scent of Madame Rousseau's fresh pastries across the square, but now it seemed oddly out of place, like a sweet note in a discordant symphony. The elderly cafe owner stood in her doorway, hands on her hips, muttering quiet prayers in French. She had seen her share of troublemakers over the years, but something about Thompson's calculated disrespect felt different, more deliberate. "Hey, my loyal followers," Thompson continued his live stream commentary. "Let's take a poll. What should I do with this fancy hat once I get it? Maybe a little dance? Or should I try spinning it on my finger like a basketball?" The comments section of his live stream exploded with suggestions, each more outrageous than the last. A few voices of reason attempted to warn him about the consequences of his actions, but they were quickly drowned out by the digital crowd's enthusiasm for chaos. Laurent remained motionless, but those who knew him well might have noticed subtle signs of his increasing alertness. The tendons in his neck stood out slightly more prominently, and his grip on the ceremonial staff had tightened just enough to whiten his knuckles. His training had prepared him for many situations, but the intersection of ancient duty and modern social media presented a unique challenge. Thompson was now close enough that his expensive cologne, an overwhelming mix of sandalwood and synthetic musk, invaded the sacred space around Laurent's post. He played to his audience with exaggerated gestures, each movement designed to maximize his online impact. "Watch this, everyone. I'm about to make this guard famous. Well, more famous than me, obviously. That's impossible." He laughed at his own joke, the sound echoing unnaturally against the cathedral walls. The square had grown unusually quiet, the normal tourist chatter replaced by a tense silence. Even the perpetual pigeons seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their usual cooing subdued. The morning sun emerged briefly from behind a cloud, causing the silver wings of Laurent's helmet to gleam with an almost ethereal light, a silent reminder of the sacred duty they represented. Local business owners along the square's edge watched with growing concern. They had seen tourists behave badly before, but Thompson's calculated disrespect, amplified by social media, felt like an assault on the very spirit of their historic space. A few reached for their phones, some to record, others to call for assistance, creating a modern Greek chorus of digital witnesses to the unfolding drama. As Thompson stepped even closer, deliberately placing one expensive loafer over the clearly marked boundary line, the tension in the square reached a critical point. The collision between sacred tradition and viral infamy was now inevitable, and the next few moments would test not just Laurent's training, but the very values that had preserved this sacred space for centuries. "Hey, Mr. Guard, or should I say Mr. Instagram Opportunity?" Thompson's voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a discordant note in a cathedral choir. He was now standing barely 3 feet from Laurent, his phone held high to capture both their faces in the frame. "Let's give my followers what they want. A little interaction with Montreal's most famous mannequin." The first test of Laurent's training came not from Thompson's words, but from the overwhelming scent of alcohol that accompanied them. Despite the early hour, It was clear the tech entrepreneur had fortified himself with liquid courage. The smell of expensive scotch, probably older than some of his followers, mingled unpleasantly with his overpowering cologne. "Come on, buddy. You can't ignore the great Alex Thompson forever." He waved his hand in front of Laurent's face, close enough that the Guardian could feel the air move but not quite making contact. "I've got 500,000 people watching right now. That's probably more than you'll see in your entire career standing here playing statue." The livestream chat exploded with a mix of encouragement and warnings. Some viewers urged Thompson on, eager for entertainment, while others tried to warn him about the seriousness of his actions. The more reasonable comments scrolled past unheeded, as Thompson focused only on those that aligned with his intentions. Laurent's eyes remained fixed forward, his posture perfect, but his mind was rapidly processing the situation. His training had covered countless scenarios, but social media had added a new dimension to the challenges faced by the Guardians. He knew that somewhere in the growing crowd, Cathedral security was already moving into position, but their response would take precious minutes. "Look at this helmet, everyone." Thompson circled Laurent like a predator, his phone capturing every angle. "Those silver wings must be worth a fortune. Probably more than this guy makes in a year. Should we see how they look on me? I bet I could rock this whole uniform better than him anyway." He reached out as if to touch the helmet but stopped, just short, testing the boundaries. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some tourists had backed away, embarrassed by the display of disrespect. Others had moved closer, phones raised, eager to capture any potential confrontation. A group of local business people watched with growing concern, their faces reflecting the shared understanding that this was more than just another tourist's bad behavior. "Sir," a voice called from the crowd, one of Thompson's own followers, a young woman who had finally found her conscience. "Maybe we should respect the tradition," but her words were cut off by Thompson's theatrical laughter. "Tradition? Please. This is the digital age, sweetheart. Everything is content waiting to happen." He turned back to Laurent, emboldened by his own words. "Speaking of content, let's see if we can get some reaction from our stoic friend here. My followers are betting you can't keep this up when I—" He extended his hand toward the ceremonial staff, not quite touching it yet, testing the waters. Laurent's breathing remained measured and controlled, but inside, his mind was cataloging every movement, every shift in Thompson's body language. Years of training had taught him to read the subtle signs that preceded actual physical confrontation. The slight shift in Thompson's weight, the positioning of his feet, the way his fingers twitched, all telegraphed his intentions clearly to the trained observer. The morning sun disappeared behind a cloud, casting the square in diffused gray light that seemed to match the growing tension. The cathedral bells began to toll the hour, their deep resonance adding a somber undertone to the scene. Each toll seemed to mark another moment closer to the inevitable confrontation. "You know what?" Thompson addressed his livestream audience, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "I think our friend here is taking this way too seriously. Let's show everyone how to have some real fun with these outdated traditions." He made a show of adjusting his camera angle, ensuring optimal coverage of whatever he was planning next. The square had grown so quiet that the sound of Thompson's expensive loafers on the cobblestones seemed unnaturally loud. The usual morning ambiance, tourist chatter, street music, cafe clatter, had been replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional whisper and the artificial shutter sounds of smartphone cameras. Laurent could sense the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way the crowd's energy had changed from mere curiosity to anticipation of conflict. His peripheral vision caught glimpses of cathedral security moving through the square, but they were still too far to intervene if Thompson decided to escalate immediately. As Thompson prepared his next move, Laurent maintained his stillness, but every muscle in his body was ready. The weight of the ceremonial staff in his hands, the pressure of the silver-winged helmet on his head, these sensations anchored him to his duty, to the sacred trust he had sworn to uphold. The next few moments would determine whether tradition and respect could withstand the onslaught of viral fame-seeking and modern irreverence. The sacred line between respect and sacrilege was about to be crossed, not with a hesitant step, but with a deliberately theatrical gesture. Thompson, emboldened by his live audience and the morning's liquid courage, made his decisive move. "All right, followers, this is what you've all been waiting for." He stretched out his hand toward Laurent's silver-winged helmet, his manicured fingers reaching for the gleaming metal that had represented centuries of tradition. "Time to upgrade your look, buddy." Thompson's voice carried a note of triumph as his fingers made contact with the left silver wing of the helmet. The touch wasn't gentle or curious. It was possessive, entitled, the grip of someone who believed money could buy anything, even respect. The polished silver, still cool from the morning air, reflected his smirking face as he began to tug at the ceremonial headpiece. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Phones trembled in nervous hands as hundreds of impromptu documentarians captured the moment. Someone in the back of the crowd shouted, "Stop him!" But the words seemed to float ineffectually in the tense air. The square had become a theater of the absurd, with Thompson playing the role of both protagonist and antagonist in his self-directed drama. "Just imagine how many likes this is going to get." Thompson's words slurred slightly as he maintained his grip on the helmet. "Me, wearing this fancy hat, doing a little dance right here in front of the cathedral. Maybe I'll even let you all vote on what moves I should do." His live-stream chat exploded with a mix of encouragement and horror, the digital audience divided between entertainment and outrage. The morning sun emerged from behind a cloud at that precise moment, causing the silver wings to flash brilliantly. The light seemed to emphasize the gravity of Thompson's transgression, highlighting the contrast between the sacred and the profane. The cathedral's ancient stones stood as silent witnesses to this modern display of disrespect, their weathered surfaces having seen centuries of both devotion and desecration. Laurent could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. The helmet, secured properly as it had been every morning for years, remained firmly in place despite Thompson's tugging. But this wasn't just about preventing the removal of a piece of ceremonial attire. It was about protecting something far more fundamental. "Come on, what's with this thing?" Thompson's voice took on a frustrated edge as the helmet refused to budge. "Is it glued to your head or something?" His initial showman's confidence began to crack slightly as his simple grab-and-go plan met with unexpected resistance. He adjusted his grip, his expensive watch scraping against the polished silver, leaving a visible smudge that seemed to physically pain the observing locals. The square had fallen into an unnatural silence, broken only by the sound of Thompson's increasingly labored breathing and the artificial clicking of camera phones. Even the ever-present pigeons seemed to have abandoned their posts, as if unwilling to witness what was unfolding. The morning breeze, which had been playfully tossing fallen leaves around the square, died away, leaving the air thick with tension. Marie Dubois, the veteran tour guide, had her hand pressed against her mouth in horror. In 15 years of conducting tours, she had seen countless examples of tourist misbehavior, but this felt different, more deliberate, more malicious. Her group of tourists stood frozen, their guidebooks forgotten in their hands, as they watched the scene unfold. "This is going viral for sure," Thompson announced to his livestream audience, trying to maintain his confident facade despite his growing frustration. "Hey, someone start a countdown in the comments. When I hit 0, we're going to show everyone what's under this fancy hat." He gave another tug, harder this time, his knuckles whitening with effort. The sound of running footsteps echoed from the cathedral's direction, security finally approaching, but they were still too far to prevent what was happening. Father Thomas stood in the cathedral doorway, his face a mask of concern as he watched this assault on centuries of tradition. His lips moved in silent prayer, though whether for the guardian's patience or the tourist's salvation wasn't clear. In that crucial moment, as Thompson's fingers maintained their grip on the sacred helmet, the very air seemed to crackle with impending consequence. The line between acceptable tourist behavior and unforgivable disrespect had not just been crossed, it had been demolished with deliberate, streaming for likes intent. What would follow in the next few seconds would become either a victory for tradition and respect, or a viral moment of desecration viewed by millions. Laurent remained straight-backed and focused, but those who knew him well might have noticed a subtle change in his bearing. His grip on the ceremonial staff shifted almost imperceptibly, and his jaw tightened just enough to suggest that the next moment would bring something unprecedented. The weight of centuries of tradition hung in the balance, awaiting the Guardian's response to this ultimate test of his sworn duty. What happened next occurred so swiftly that many onlookers would later debate exactly how it unfolded. Laurent's transformation from stoic statue to living embodiment of authority happened in the space of a single heartbeat. His voice, unused for hours, cut through the square like a steel blade through silk. "Remove your hand from the sacred helmet, immediately." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Laurent's tone carried the weight of centuries, each syllable precisely measured and delivered with unmistakable authority. The command seemed to freeze the very air in the square, causing several nearby tourists to take involuntary steps backward. Thompson's fingers, still gripping the silver wing of the helmet, suddenly felt very exposed. His livestream audience, which had been eagerly anticipating his triumph, now watched in stunned silence as the power dynamic shifted seismically. The tech entrepreneur's confident smirk flickered, replaced momentarily by an expression of uncertainty he hadn't worn since his pre-millionaire days. "Oh, so now you can talk?" Thompson attempted to maintain his bravado, but his voice had lost its theatrical projection. "About time. My followers were starting to think you were some kind of robot." He tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced and hollow, echoing awkwardly against the cathedral walls. Laurent's next movement was so precise and controlled it appeared almost choreographed. Without shifting his gaze or breaking his posture, he rotated the ceremonial staff exactly 45 degrees, its polished surface catching the morning light. This subtle action, drilled into every guardian during their training, carried clear meaning to anyone who understood the tradition. It was the last warning before action would be taken. "You are in violation of sacred ground," Laurent continued, each word measured and clear. "Your actions are being recorded by cathedral security, and you will be held accountable." The formal warning, delivered in perfect English, carried none of the emotional tension that typically accompanied such confrontations. Instead, it resonated with something far more powerful: absolute certainty. Thompson's followers, who had been positioning themselves for the best camera angles, began to shift uncomfortably. Their phones remained raised, but several of them had backed away, sensing the shift in atmosphere. The live stream chat, which had been a cascade of encouraging emojis and excited comments, now filled with warnings and nervous observations. "Listen, man." Thompson's grip on the helmet loosened slightly, but his ego wouldn't let him fully retreat. "Do you know who I am? I could buy this entire cathedral if I wanted to. This is just content for my followers. It's good for tourism." His words, meant to sound confident, came out defensive and slightly panicked. Laurent remained perfectly still save for his eyes, which now locked directly onto Thompson's face. The guard's gaze held no anger, no emotion at all, just the inexorable weight of duty. "Your wealth is irrelevant here," he stated, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent square. "This ground has stood sacred for centuries before you, and it will remain so long after you are forgotten." The morning sun emerged fully from behind a cloud, and the silver wings of the helmet suddenly blazed with light. Thompson instinctively squinted, his designer sunglasses providing little protection against the brilliant reflection. In that moment of disorientation, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine uncertainty about his position of power. "The next action is yours to choose," Laurent continued, his tone remaining measured but carrying an unmistakable note of finality. "But be aware that every choice has consequences." The ceremonial staff in his hands caught the same sunlight that had dazzled Thompson, its polished surface seeming to glow with inner authority. The square held its collective breath. Local vendors who had seen their share of tourist misbehavior watched with grim satisfaction as the tide turned. Father Thomas, still standing in the cathedral doorway, nodded slightly, not in approval of the confrontation, but in recognition of duty being upheld. Thompson's livestream followers watched as their usually confident leader visibly struggled with his options. His carefully curated image of untouchable success was cracking under the weight of authentic authority. The comments section of his stream had transformed from a chorus of encouragement to a flood of viewers urging him to back down. Hey, I was just trying to make some content here, Thompson attempted one last time, his voice now carrying a distinct note of uncertainty. It's just a hat, right? Just a costume for tourists. But even as he spoke these words, their hollowness was evident to everyone in the square, including, finally, himself. Laurent's only response was to maintain his unwavering gaze, his position now radiating an authority that made Thompson's wealth and social media influence seem suddenly insignificant. The next moments would determine whether the tech entrepreneur would choose wisdom or escalation, but one thing had become crystal clear to everyone present. The real power in this situation no longer resided with the man who could buy the cathedral. The tense standoff was suddenly interrupted by the sound of measured footsteps on cobblestone. Through the crowd emerged an elderly man, his silver hair catching the morning light, wearing a meticulously pressed navy blue blazer with military medals pinned to the chest. Colonel Jean-Pierre Beaumont, retired from the Royal Canadian Armed Forces, moved with the kind of deliberate grace that spoke of decades of service. At 78 years old, the colonel carried himself with the same dignity he had shown during his 40 years of military service. His presence drew attention not through force or volume, but through the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from his very being. The crowd instinctively parted to let him through, their phones still recording but now split between capturing Thompson's confrontation and this new development. "Young man," the colonel's voice carried clearly across the square, his French-Canadian accent lending additional gravity to his words. "I've been watching this display of disrespect from the cafe, and I can no longer remain silent." He stopped a few paces from Thompson, his weathered hands resting on a polished maple wood cane that looked more ceremonial than necessary. Thompson turned toward the new voice, his phone swiveling to capture this unexpected addition to his content. "Hey, Gramps, this is a private show here. Why don't you—" His words died in his throat as he noticed the medals on the colonel's chest, their significance perhaps not fully understood, but their authority undeniable. "Private?" The colonel's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've made this very public, haven't you? Broadcasting your disrespect to the world as if tradition and honor were mere entertainment for your followers?" He gestured toward the silver-winged helmet that Thompson's hand still hovered near. "Do you know what those wings represent?" The square had grown even quieter, if possible. Even the perpetual hum of traffic from beyond the square seemed muted. Several of Thompson's followers had lowered their phones, some looking distinctly uncomfortable as the colonel continued speaking. Those wings were forged in 1742, from silver donated by the first families of Montreal. They survived the Great Fire of 1856 because a guardian, much like the one you're harassing, risked his life to protect them. The colonel's voice carried no anger, only a profound sadness. Each feather represents a decade of service, of sacrifice, of maintaining the sacred trust between our past and our future. Thompson's live-stream chat was now flooding with comments about the colonel, many viewers seemingly more interested in the medals on his chest than the original confrontation. "Look, I appreciate the history lesson," Thompson attempted to regain control of the narrative. "But this is about entertainment, about giving people what they want to see." "What they want to see?" The colonel took another step forward, his cane tapping softly on the cobblestones. "Let me tell you what I see. I see a man who has mistaken wealth for worth, who believes that tradition exists only for his amusement." He turned slightly, addressing the crowd and, by extension, Thompson's online audience. "But true worth isn't measured in followers or funds. It's measured in respect, in understanding that some things exist beyond our right to touch or take." Laurent remained motionless, but those who knew him might have noticed a subtle change in his bearing, a slight softening of his rigid posture in acknowledgement of the colonel's words. The two men, though separated by generations, were united in their understanding of duty and honor. "When I was a young officer," the colonel continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone, "I learned that authority isn't about power. It's about responsibility. Each of us who wear a uniform, whether military or ceremonial, carries that responsibility." He gestured to the cathedral behind them. "This isn't just a tourist attraction, monsieur. It's a living testament to the values that built this city, this country. The morning sun had fully emerged now, casting long shadows across the square. The colonel's medals gleamed in the light, each one telling its own story of service and sacrifice. Even Thompson's expensive designer clothes seemed somehow diminished in comparison to the simple dignity of the elderly veteran's bearing. "So now you have a choice," the colonel concluded, his voice firm but not unkind. "You can continue this path, adding another chapter to a story of disrespect that will follow you long after your live stream ends. Or you can demonstrate to your followers what real strength looks like. The strength to acknowledge when you're wrong, to show respect even when no one forces you to." The square held its breath, waiting to see how Thompson would respond to this unexpected intervention. The tech entrepreneur's phone wavered slightly in his hand, his live stream capturing a moment very different from the viral content he had planned. The choice before him was no longer simply about a helmet or a social media stunt. It had become a public referendum on the very values the colonel had so eloquently defended. Thompson's response to the colonel's words came not with wisdom, but with wounded pride. His face flushed red, partly from the morning's drinks, but mostly from the embarrassment of being lectured in front of his live stream audience. "You know what?" he snarled, his carefully cultivated social media persona cracking completely. "I've had enough of this whole respect and tradition routine." In a move that drew audible gasps from the crowd, Thompson suddenly grabbed the helmet with both hands, his phone clattering to the cobblestones. "If you won't play along for the content, then I'll make my own." His knuckles whitened with effort as he attempted to wrench the ceremonial helmet from Laurent's head. The silver wings caught the morning light one last time before being tarnished by Thompson's grip. The colonel took a step forward, but Laurent's slight headshake stopped him. This was now beyond words or wisdom. It had become a moment of action. The square seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension almost unbearable. Even the dropped phone continued streaming, its fallen angle capturing the scene from a dramatic low perspective. "Just come off," Thompson grunted through gritted teeth, his designer jacket straining at the shoulders as he pulled. His followers had backed away, many lowering their phones, no longer eager to document their leader's descent into pure disrespect. The live stream chat exploded with messages of shock and dismay, the digital audience witnessing the complete unraveling of their influencer's carefully constructed image. Laurent remained straight-backed, his body tensed but controlled. The ceremonial staff in his right hand hadn't moved, but his grip had shifted ever so slightly. Years of training crystallized into this singular moment, the point where duty met direct challenge. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scene, highlighting the stark contrast between Thompson's contorted face and Laurent's composed expression. Father Thomas had emerged fully from the cathedral now, standing at the top of the steps with several other clergy members. Their presence added another layer of gravity to the scene, silent witnesses to this modern-day desecration. The priest's lips moved in quiet prayer, though whether for Laurent's patience or Thompson's salvation wasn't clear. "You think you're better than me?" Thompson's voice had lost all pretense of showmanship, revealing the raw insecurity beneath. "With your fancy uniform and your precious traditions, I made more money last month than you'll see in your lifetime." Spittle flew from his lips as he shouted, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of scotch in a nauseating cloud. Marie Dubois, the veteran tour guide, had her hands pressed against her mouth in horror. In 15 years of conducting tours, she had seen countless examples of tourist misbehavior, but this was different. This was malice meeting tradition head-on. Her tour group stood frozen, their guidebooks forgotten, as they watched the scene unfold. The old street artist, Pierre, had stopped painting entirely. His half-finished watercolor captured the scene in brutal honesty. The guardian standing firm, the attacker's face twisted with rage, the crowd's expressions ranging from shock to disgust. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he gripped his brush, feeling each second stretch like an eternity. Thompson's next move crossed the final line. His right hand released the helmet only to ball into a fist, drawing back with clear intent. "Let's see how traditional you are with a bloody nose." The threat echoed across the square, bouncing off the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of both devotion and desecration. The colonel's voice cut through the tension. "Son, don't." Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of decades of command. Yet Thompson was beyond hearing, beyond reason. His fist began its forward motion, aimed directly at Laurent's face. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as everyone in the square watched the ultimate boundary being crossed. Laurent's eyes, which had remained fixed forward throughout the entire confrontation, finally moved. They locked onto Thompson's with a gaze that contained no anger, no fear, only the absolute certainty of what would follow. The ceremonial staff in his hand shifted position by mere millimeters, its polished surface catching the light one final time before duty demanded action. The square itself seemed to be holding its breath. The cathedral bells chose that exact moment to begin tolling, their deep resonance adding a somber soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Each toll seemed to mark another fraction of a second, as Thompson's fist continued its journey through the air, aimed at destroying not just Laurent's composure, but centuries of tradition and respect. What would happen in the next moment would be captured by dozens of phones, shared across multiple platforms and discussed for months to come. But for those present in the square, it would be remembered not for its viral potential, but for the instant when sacred duty met modern disrespect in a collision that would leave no one unchanged. Laurent's response to Thompson's attack came with the swift precision of countless hours of training. In one fluid motion, almost too fast for the watching crowd to follow, the ceremonial staff swept upward. The polished oak caught Thompson's descending fist with mathematical precision, redirecting its force harmlessly to the side. The tech entrepreneur's momentum carried him forward, his designer shoes losing purchase on the ancient cobblestones. What happened next occurred in the space of 3 heartbeats. First, Laurent stepped sideways, his movement so precise it seemed choreographed, allowing Thompson's stumbling form to pass him. Second, the ceremonial staff twisted in Laurent's hands, its lower end hooking Thompson's ankle while its upper portion pressed firmly against his shoulder. Third, with the gentlest possible application of leverage, Laurent guided his attacker to the ground. Thompson landed with a grunt, his expensive jacket scraping against the weathered cobblestones. His fall wasn't violent or dramatic. Instead, it was controlled and almost elegant, like a dancer being lowered to the stage. The impact was just enough to knock the wind from his lungs and the fight from his spirit. He lay there, gasping, his face pressed against the same stones countless pilgrims had walked upon for centuries. Laurent's voice, when it came, carried across the silent square with crystal clarity. The sacred guard exists not to fight, but to protect. Not to harm, but to preserve. His words weren't directed at Thompson alone, but to everyone present, to the phones still recording, to the very stones of the cathedral itself. We guard not just physical spaces, but the principles they represent. The colonel nodded slowly, understanding the significance of what he'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a security guard subduing a troublemaker. It was centuries of tradition proving its enduring relevance. Laurent had responded with exactly enough force to stop the attack, not an ounce more. His actions demonstrated not just skill, but wisdom. Thompson's followers stood in stunned silence, their phones still recording, but their expressions transformed. They had come expecting to capture a viral moment of rebellion against tradition, but instead had witnessed a masterclass in dignity and controlled response. Their live-stream comments section had exploded with a mix of awe and reflection, many viewers openly reconsidering their earlier encouragement of Thompson's behavior. "I could have you arrested," Thompson wheezed as he pushed himself to his knees, his bravado deflated but not entirely extinguished. "Do you know how many lawyers I have on retainer?" But his words lacked conviction now, ringing hollow against the cathedral walls. His designer sunglasses lay broken beside him, a crack running through one lens like a statement on his fractured authority. Laurent's response was to extend his free hand toward Thompson, offering assistance in rising. The gesture contained no mockery, no triumph, only the same steady dignity that had characterized his every action. "You may pursue legal action if you wish," he said calmly. "But first I invite you to stand up, dust yourself off, and consider what you've learned here today." The morning sun, which had been playing hide-and-seek with the clouds, chose this moment to emerge fully. Its rays caught the silver wings of Laurent's helmet, creating a halo effect that wasn't lost on the watching crowd. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Light illuminating tradition's victory over chaos, wisdom's triumph over arrogance. Father Thomas had descended the cathedral steps, his presence adding another layer of gravity to the scene. Perhaps, he suggested gently, this would be a good moment for reflection. The cathedral's doors are open to all who seek understanding. His words carried no judgment, offering instead a path to redemption that Thompson desperately needed. The tech entrepreneur's face worked through a complex series of emotions: anger, embarrassment, confusion, and finally, something approaching understanding. His carefully curated image lay in shambles around him, but paradoxically, this might have been the most authentic moment he'd had in years. Looking up at Laurent still holding out his helping hand, Thompson seemed to see the guardian, really see him, for the first time. The crowd watched in tense silence as Thompson considered his options. His phone lay forgotten on the cobblestones, still streaming, capturing this moment of decision from its awkward angle. The morning breeze carried the scent of incense from the cathedral, a subtle reminder of the sacred nature of the space where this drama had unfolded. Laurent remained perfectly still, his hand extended, embodying the principle that true strength lies not in domination, but in the offer of redemption after correction. The ceremonial staff in his other hand caught the sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the scene in miniature, a moment of potential transformation hanging in the balance between pride and humility, between viral infamy and genuine growth. For what felt like an eternity, Thompson remained on his knees, staring at Laurent's extended hand as if it were some foreign object he couldn't quite comprehend. The square had fallen so silent that the gentle fluttering of pigeons' wings echoed off the cathedral walls. Finally, in a moment that would be replayed thousands of times across social media, Thompson reached up and grasped the offered hand. Laurent's grip was firm but gentle as he helped his former antagonist to his feet. Thompson's designer jacket was scuffed, his carefully styled hair disheveled, and his entire carefully constructed image of invincibility lay in tatters around him. Yet somehow he seemed more human now than he had all morning. The tech entrepreneur brushed dust from his clothes with trembling hands, his movements uncertain, like a man awakening from a long dream. I don't... Thompson started to speak, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words for the first time in his social media career. His phone lay forgotten on the cobblestones, still streaming to an audience that had witnessed his complete transformation from aggressor to humbled observer. The crack in his designer sunglasses seemed to mirror the crack in his facade. The colonel stepped forward, his military medals catching the morning light. "Sometimes, young man," he said softly, "our greatest moments come not from our victories, but from how we handle our defeats." His words carried no judgment, only the wisdom of years. What matters now is what you choose to do with this moment. Thompson's followers had begun to lower their phones, many of them looking as transformed as their leader. The live stream chat, which had earlier encouraged chaos, now filled with messages of reflection and respect. Several viewers were sharing their own stories of times when pride had led them astray, turning the digital space into an impromptu confessional. Father Thomas approached, his robes rustling softly against the ancient stones. "The cathedral's morning mass will begin shortly," he announced, his voice gentle but carrying. "All are welcome to attend, to reflect, to find peace." The invitation hung in the air like incense, offering a path to redemption that required only the courage to take the first step. Laurent had resumed his post, his posture perfect, his bearing unchanged by the confrontation. The ceremonial staff had returned to its traditional position, and the silver wings of his helmet gleamed in the morning sun. His face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, only the same steady dedication to duty that had guided his actions throughout the encounter. Thompson bent down to retrieve his phone, its screen still recording. For a moment he stared at his own live stream, at the comments scrolling past, at the digital kingdom he had built on spectacle and controversy. Then, with hands that shook only slightly, he pressed the end stream button. The gesture was small, but profound. A choice of substance over show, of reality over performance. "I owe you an apology," Thompson said, his voice rough with emotion. He wasn't playing to an audience now. His words were genuine, perhaps for the first time that morning. "I owe all of you an apology." His gesture encompassed not just Laurent, but the Colonel, Father Thomas, and everyone who had witnessed his actions. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. A spontaneous applause broke out, not the mocking kind that often follows public humiliation, but the genuine appreciation of witnesses to authentic transformation. Several tourists wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the unexpected turn of events. Even the ever-present pigeons seemed to settle more peacefully on their perches. Marie Dubois, the veteran tour guide, smiled softly as she gathered her group. She knew that tomorrow's tour would include this story, not as a tale of conflict, but as an example of how tradition and modernity could find common ground through respect and understanding. Old Pierre, the street artist, had already begun sketching the scene's resolution, his skilled hands capturing the moment when pride gave way to humility. As the cathedral bells began to toll for morning mass, Thompson took one last look at Laurent, then at his phone, and made his decision. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the cathedral steps, following Father Thomas into the sacred space. Several of his followers, after a moment's hesitation, joined him. The colonel remained in the square, standing at parade rest, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had witnessed countless battles in his military career, but few victories as meaningful as this one. A triumph not of force, but of dignity and tradition, over chaos and disrespect. Laurent remained at his post as the square gradually returned to its normal rhythm. The morning sun continued its arc across the sky, tourists resumed their photos from respectful distances, and the ancient stones absorbed another chapter in their long history. But something had changed. Something subtle yet profound. Each person who had witnessed the confrontation and its resolution carried with them a renewed appreciation for the things that stood solid and unwavering in an increasingly ephemeral world. The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through the grand cathedral square like waves in a pond. The morning crowd, which had witnessed the entire encounter, remained gathered in small clusters, their voices a mix of excitement and awe as they discussed what they had just seen. Phones were held close as people replayed their recordings, each viewing revealing new details of the remarkable encounter. Social media platforms exploded with activity as videos of the incident spread across the internet. Sacred Guardian and Montreal Guard began trending, with clips of Laurent's measured response being shared and commented upon by millions. But unlike typical viral content that focused on conflict and chaos, these videos captured something different. A moment of grace under pressure, of tradition standing firm against disrespect. The tour guides in the square found themselves adapting their scripts in real time. Marie Dubois, speaking to her wide-eyed group, gestured toward Laurent's post. "What you see here is not just a uniform or a position," she explained, her voice carrying new authority. "Today, we witnessed the living embodiment of our city's values. The silver wings on that helmet don't just represent the past. They represent an ongoing commitment to dignity and respect." Local news crews had begun arriving, drawn by the social media buzz. Their cameras captured the aftermath, the respectful distance now maintained by tourists, the renewed interest in the ceremonial aspects of the guard's position, the spontaneous discussions about tradition and modern values. Several reporters attempted to interview Laurent, but he maintained his post with characteristic dignity, letting his actions speak louder than any words could. Inside the cathedral, where Thompson had followed Father Thomas, the morning mass proceeded with an unusual number of attendees. Many of Thompson's followers, who had come to Montreal seeking social media content, found themselves instead participating in a moment of genuine reflection. The ancient hymns and prayers took on new meaning in the context of what they had witnessed outside. The colonel remained in the square, fielding questions from curious onlookers. His military bearing and eloquent defense of tradition had made him an unexpected second hero of the story. What you saw today, he explained to a gathering crowd, was not just about a guard and a tourist. It was about the choice we all face, to respect the foundations upon which our society is built, or to treat everything as disposable content. Old Pierre, the street artist, found himself surrounded by people interested in purchasing his sketches of the incident. His quick captures of the confrontation and resolution had an emotional authenticity that no digital recording could match. His weathered hands worked quickly, adding final touches to what would become his most sought-after works. The comment sections of Thompson's final livestream had transformed into something unprecedented. Instead of the usual toxic mix of trolling and superficial reactions, genuine discussions were taking place. People shared stories of their own moments of humbling, of times when they had learned the hard way about the importance of respect. The digital space, usually a catalyst for conflict, had become a forum for reflection. Madame Rousseau's cafe was packed with people discussing the event over coffee and croissants. The elderly proprietor moved among her customers, hearing snippets of conversation in various languages, all centered on the morning's drama. "In 40 years of business," she told anyone who would listen, "I have never seen anything quite like it. This is what happens when tradition knows how to stand its ground with grace." Around Laurent's post, the atmosphere had changed subtly but significantly. Tourists still took photos, but now they did so with visible respect, many bowing slightly before raising their cameras. Parents could be heard explaining to their children not just about the guard's uniform and position, but about the values he represented. The invisible line between public space and sacred duty had become clearer, respected not out of fear, but understanding. Several of Thompson's followers approached Laurent's post, not to take selfies but to lay their phones on the cobblestones in a gesture of respect before retrieving them and walking away. This impromptu ritual, captured and shared across social media, began trending as the number Guardian Respect Challenge, prompting discussions about social media responsibility and the meaning of genuine content. The Cathedral's security team, which had arrived moments too late for the confrontation, found themselves instead managing the peaceful aftermath. They established quiet corridors through the growing crowd, ensuring that both tourists and worshippers could move freely while maintaining the newfound atmosphere of respect. As the morning progressed, tour buses continued to arrive, their guides now incorporating the fresh story into their narratives. The tale of the guard who had defended tradition with dignity was already becoming part of the square's rich history. Each telling added subtle embellishments, but the core truth remained unchanged, a moment when ancient values had proved their worth in the modern world. As evening approached and the shadows lengthened across the grand cathedral square, the events of the morning had already begun transforming into legend. The setting sun painted the cathedral's stones in warm golden hues, and Laurent's silver-winged helmet caught the light one final time before his shift ended. But this was no ordinary changing of the guard. The square remained filled with people all waiting to witness this last moment of an extraordinary day. Thompson had emerged from the cathedral hours earlier, a changed man. Before leaving the square, he had posted one final message to his millions of followers. "Today, I learned that some traditions aren't meant to be challenged. They're meant to be understood. I'm taking a break from social media to reflect on what really matters." The post, devoid of hashtags or calls for likes, had garnered more genuine engagement than any of his previous viral stunts. The colonel had spent the afternoon speaking with young people in the square, sharing stories not of military victories but of moments when tradition and honor had prevailed in unexpected ways. "What we witnessed today," he told them, "wasn't just about a guard defending his post. It was about the enduring power of dignity in an age that too often mistakes noise for significance." Local news crews had come and gone, but their stories were already airing across Canada. The headlines didn't focus on conflict or controversy, but on redemption. Sacred tradition meets modern world, a lesson in respect. Montreal Guard demonstrates power of dignified response. Ancient values prove their worth in digital age. The footage would be used in training sessions for security personnel worldwide, a masterclass in de-escalation through unwavering principle. Marie Dubois had given her final tour of the day, her voice thick with emotion as she explained to her group. For generations to come, guides will tell this story, not because of the confrontation, but because of the resolution. This square has witnessed centuries of history, but some moments remind us why we preserve these traditions in the first place. Old Pierre's sketches of the incident had all sold, but he refused to make prints. Some moments, he explained in his gravelly French, deserve to remain unique. His favorite piece, showing Laurent helping Thompson to his feet, would later be donated to the Cathedral's museum. A testament to the day tradition extended a helping hand to modernity. The Cathedral gift shop had sold out of replica silver wing pins, hastily commissioned by Father Thomas. Each one came with a card reading, a reminder that true strength lies not in dominance, but in dignity. The proceeds would go to maintaining the ancient Guardian Order, ensuring its traditions could continue in an ever-changing world. As Laurent prepared to end his shift, something unprecedented occurred. The crowd, which had maintained a respectful distance all day, spontaneously formed an honor guard of their own. 2 straight lines emerged, creating a path from his post to the cathedral steps. Phones were lowered, not to record, but out of respect. The square fell silent save for the evening bells. Laurent's replacement, arriving for the night shift, found himself witnessing something remarkable. His fellow guardian completed his final turn with perfect precision, but as he began his march from the post, something unexpected happened. The colonel stepped forward and called out in a clear, commanding voice, "Guard, halt!" Laurent stopped, his training responding automatically to the military command. The colonel approached, his medals catching the last rays of sunlight. In his hands was a small wooden box, its surface worn with age. "On behalf of those who understand the value of what you protect," he announced, his voice carrying across the hushed square, "I present you with this." Inside the box was a silver medallion, the colonel's own medal for valor earned decades ago. "Some might say this belongs in a museum," the colonel said, loud enough for all to hear. But today proved that valor isn't just about battlefield courage. It's about standing firm when principles are challenged, about responding to disrespect with dignity. Laurent accepted the medal with a precise nod, his first visible expression of emotion all day. The crowd erupted in applause, not the raucous cheering of entertainment, but the deep appreciation of witnesses to something profound. Parents lifted children to their shoulders, ensuring they would remember this moment when tradition proved its living relevance. As darkness settled over Montreal, the video of the morning's events continued spreading across the globe. But unlike typical viral content, it sparked conversations about respect, tradition, and the search for meaning in a digital age. Comment sections, usually cesspools of cynicism, filled with stories of personal transformation and renewed appreciation for enduring values. The last light faded from the cathedral's spires, and the square slowly emptied. But something had changed, not just in the viral videos or trending hashtags, but in the very spirit of the place. The ancient stones had witnessed countless dramas over the centuries, but today they had seen something rare. A moment when the old ways had not merely survived a challenge, but had shown their timeless relevance to a world desperate for authenticity and grace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.